I stood in the grand dining hall, my hands trembling as I held my spoon. The chandelier above me sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, but its brilliance only made me feel smaller. My mother-in-law, Evelyn Lancaster, sat at the head of the table, her cold gaze piercing through me. "A woman of your background should be grateful to sit at this table," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Tell me, what was it like growing up without wealth?" The guest chuckled. My cheeks burned with humiliation. She had no idea who my father was. If only she knew. The night air outside the Lancaster estate was crisp, but inside the grand mansion, the air was thick with tension. I sat stiffly at the dining table, surrounded by polished silverware and porcelain plates worth more than my entire childhood home. My husband, Daniel, sat beside me, his fingers resting lightly against my hand in silent reassurance. Evelyn Lancaster, his mother, the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in the city, eyed me like a flaw in an otherwise perfect portrait. From the moment Daniel had introduced me as his wife, she had made her disapproval abundantly clear. I was not the woman she had envisioned for her only son. "You never told us much about your family, dear," Evelyn said, sipping her wine. "What does your father do?" I hesitated. My father was a man of great power and influence, but I had grown up without his presence. To the world, he was an enigma, feared and respected in equal measure. To me, he was a ghost, a legend I had only heard of but never truly known. "My mother raised me alone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "She worked hard to provide for me." Evelyn's lips curled into a smirk. "Ah, a struggling single mother. That must have been difficult." Her words carried an air of superiority, as if she had never encountered hardship in her life. The other guests exchanged amused glances, their laughter barely concealed behind delicate hands. My humiliation deepened, but I refused to let it show. Daniel tensed beside me. "Mother, that is enough." Evelyn waved a dismissive hand. "I am only trying to understand where she comes from. It is important to know a person's roots, do you not agree?" I clenched my hands beneath the table, my nails digging into my palm. I had spent my entire life fighting for dignity, for respect, and now I found myself reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for the amusement of the wealthy elite. My childhood had been far from easy. My mother, a strong-willed woman with an unbreakable spirit, had shielded me from the harshest struggles, but I had always known that we were different from others. Money had been tight, and opportunities were scarce. Yet, she had instilled in me a sense of pride, a belief that one's worth was not determined by wealth. Evelyn, however, lived in a world where status defined everything. "I must say, it is quite surprising that Daniel chose to marry someone so unrefined," she continued, her tone as sharp as a blade. "One would think he would find a partner more suited to our world." I opened my mouth to respond, but Daniel beat me to it. "I married her because I love her," he said firmly. "And that is all that matters." Evelyn sighed, as if indulging a child's foolishness. "Love is a fragile thing, dear. It cannot erase the reality of one's upbringing." I exhaled slowly, willing myself to remain composed. She wanted a reaction from me, wanted me to lash out so she could prove I did not belong. But I would not give her that satisfaction. Instead, I smiled. "You are right, Mrs. Lancaster. Upbringing does shape a person. My mother taught me resilience, kindness, and the value of hard work. I may not have grown up in wealth, but I know what it means to stand on my own 2 feet." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed Evelyn's face before she masked it with indifference. How quaint. The dinner continued with polite conversation, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Every glance Evelyn cast in my direction was a silent challenge, every word laced with veiled contempt. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel and I retreated to our room. He shut the door behind us and let out a frustrated sigh. "I am sorry," he said, rubbing his temple. "She had no right to speak to you that way." I shook my head. "It does not matter, Daniel. I knew this would not be easy." He took my hands in his eyes filled with regret. "I hate that she makes you feel this way. If she knew the truth." I placed a finger against his lips. "Not yet." He nodded reluctantly. We had agreed to keep my father's identity a secret for now. It was not time. But Evelyn Lancaster had made a grave mistake in underestimating me. She thought I was just a poor girl with no standing, no influence. She had no idea what was coming. The days that followed were a test of patience. Every encounter with Evelyn Lancaster felt like a carefully orchestrated game, one where she held all the power, and I was merely a participant, expected to lose. She would make passing comments about my lack of refinement, my unfamiliarity with high society, and my supposed ignorance of luxury. "This tea set," she remarked one afternoon, holding up a delicate porcelain cup, "is from a rare European collection. I imagine you have never seen anything quite like it before." I smiled politely. "It is lovely. Indeed." She took a slow sip. "Tell me, dear, what was it like growing up in such modest conditions?" She was fishing for an emotional reaction. I refused to give her one. "It taught me to appreciate the little things," I said calmly. "Not everyone has the privilege of excess, but I believe true wealth is found in character, not possessions." Her lips pressed together in mild irritation. She did not expect me to hold my ground so effortlessly. Daniel did his best to shield me from his mother's cruelty, but there were moments when he could not intervene. She was too clever, too subtle in her attacks, disguising them as mere observations, as if she were simply stating facts rather than delivering insults. One evening, she arranged for us to attend a charity gala. It was an event filled with dignitaries, business tycoons, and the elite of society. She insisted I wear one of her dresses, an extravagant gown that I suspected was chosen specifically to make me feel out of place. "You must understand, appearances matter in our world," she said as I examined the shimmering fabric. "One must look the part, even if they do not truly belong." I met her gaze with quiet confidence. I have always believed that authenticity matters more than appearances. She only smiled. How charming. At the gala, I could feel the curious glances, hear the whispered speculations about me. The unknown woman who had married into one of the wealthiest families. Some were polite, others less so. A group of women gathered near the grand chandelier, their laughter light but their words sharp. "I heard she comes from nothing," one of them whispered. "Can you imagine? A Lancaster marrying a commoner? I give it a year at most." I ignored them. I had spent my life proving my worth, and I would not start justifying myself to those who judged me based on my background. Then, Evelyn approached with a well-dressed older woman. "Elena, I would like you to meet Mrs. Davenport. She comes from one of the oldest families in the country. She has graciously agreed to offer you some guidance." Mrs. Davenport smiled in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. "It must be overwhelming for you, dear. Learning to navigate our world is not easy for someone unaccustomed to it." I tilted my head slightly. "You assume I am unfamiliar with this world." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Are you not?" I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. "Let us just say I am more connected than you realize." Evelyn's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she composed herself. "Is that so?" I simply smiled. The time for the truth was approaching, but not yet. As the evening continued, I maintained my composure, refusing to let the weight of their judgment crush me. But I knew one thing for certain. Evelyn Lancaster thought she knew who I was. She had no idea what was coming. The evening of the gala had left Evelyn Lancaster more curious than ever. She was not the type of woman who tolerated mysteries, and my vague responses had only fueled her desire to uncover whatever secret I was hiding. A few days later, Daniel and I were invited, though it felt more like a summons, to a formal family gathering at the Lancaster estate. The guest list included prominent figures from high society, business magnates, and old family friends. Evelyn had arranged this event specifically to showcase her power and influence, and I knew she planned to use it as an opportunity to further humiliate me. As we arrived, I could already sense the tension in the air. The grandeur of the mansion was even more imposing under the golden chandeliers, the walls lined with paintings worth more than my childhood home. The guests greeted Daniel warmly, but their smiles wavered when they turned to me. I was an outsider in their world, and they did not bother to hide it. Evelyn, of course, was in her element. Dressed in an elegant emerald gown, she moved through the crowd like a queen among subjects. Eventually, she called for everyone's attention. "Tonight," she announced, "we celebrate family legacy, and the values that define us. Her eyes flickered toward me. It is also a chance for us to learn more about those who have recently joined our esteemed circle. I knew what she was doing. She wanted to corner me, to expose my lack of pedigree in front of her influential guests. Elena, she said smoothly, perhaps you could share a little about your background. I am sure everyone would love to know where you come from. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. I could see the anticipation in their expressions, the eagerness to witness yet another moment where the poor girl from nowhere was reminded of her place. I met Evelyn's gaze, my expression calm. Of course, I said. But first, may I ask a question? She tilted her head slightly, intrigued but wary. Certainly. What do you know about Alexander Grayson? I asked. A murmur ran through the crowd. The name had an immediate effect. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged glances of surprise. Evelyn's confident smile faltered for the first time. Alexander Grayson? She repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. The Alexander Grayson? I nodded. Yes. The billionaire, the philanthropist, the man whose influence extends far beyond what most people can comprehend. Evelyn frowned, her eyes narrowing. What does he have to do with this conversation? I took a deep breath, my voice unwavering. He is my father. A gasp rippled through the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn's face drained of color. For the first time since I had met her, she was speechless. You are lying, she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. I reached into my purse and pulled out a letter, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. This is a letter from Alexander Grayson himself, I said. It confirms my identity as his daughter. I handed it to Daniel, who read it before passing it to Evelyn. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. As she scanned the words, her eyes widened in shock. The truth was undeniable. You expect us to believe that you are the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world, she stammered. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Believe what you wish, but the truth remains the same. The room was silent. The same people who had whispered about my supposed insignificance were now stunned into silence. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. Why did you not say anything before? Because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing, I said simply. And now I know. Evelyn looked around, realizing that all eyes were now on her. The woman who had spent weeks belittling me, treating me as unworthy, was now faced with the reality that I outranked her in every possible way. For the first time she had lost control. And I had won. The silence in the grand hall was suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused to absorb the weight of my revelation. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my expression composed. I had learned long ago that power was not just about wealth. It was about control. Evelyn Lancaster, the woman who had spent every moment trying to break me, now stood frozen, clutching the letter from my father. Her elegant mask of superiority had cracked, and for the first time, I saw something resembling fear in her eyes. Daniel was the first to break the silence. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. You never told me, he said softly. I met his gaze, my voice steady. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for my father's name. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I understand, he said after a moment. Then to my surprise he smiled. But I have to admit, you certainly know how to make an entrance. A murmur of uneasy laughter rippled through the crowd, though Evelyn remained silent. Her grip on the letter tightened, as if she could crush the truth between her fingers. This does not change anything, she said, her voice regaining some of its sharpness. Money does not buy class. Just because your father is wealthy, does not mean you belong in this world. I tilted my head, considering her words. You are right, I said. Money does not buy class. But neither does cruelty. A few guests exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. Evelyn had spent so much time ensuring that I felt small, yet now, she was the one under scrutiny. Your father abandoned you, she said, desperate to regain control. If he truly cared, he would have been in your life. I sighed. That is the only part where you are correct, I admitted. My father and I were estranged. But that does not change the fact that I am his daughter. And whether you like it or not, That makes me far more powerful than you ever imagined. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had lost. I turned to Daniel. I am sorry you had to find out this way, I said. I never wanted to deceive you. He shook his head. You did not deceive me. You protected yourself. He took my hands, squeezing them gently. And I love you for that. Relief flooded through me. No matter how the world saw me now, Daniel's love had not changed. Evelyn, however, was not ready to accept defeat. You may have wealth, but that does not mean you will ever be good enough for my son. Daniel turned to her, his expression firm. Mother, that is enough. She looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. You are choosing her over your own family? I am choosing the woman I love, he said. And if you cannot accept that, then you are the one who will be left behind. Evelyn's face paled. She had spent her life controlling everything around her, but now, her own son was slipping through her fingers. I did not need to say anything else. I had already won. As Daniel and I walked out of the grand hall, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known before. For the first time, I was not the poor girl struggling to prove her worth. I was Elena Grayson, the daughter of a powerful man, the wife of a good man, and a woman who had stood her ground. Evelyn Lancaster had tried to break me, but I had risen above her. The ride home was quiet. Daniel held my hand, his grip warm and reassuring, but I could tell he was deep in thought. I could not blame him. In a single evening, everything had changed. As we entered our home, he finally spoke. Elena, do you regret not telling me earlier? I sighed, leaning against the back of the couch. A part of me wonders if I should have, I admitted. But I needed to know that you loved me for me, not for my father's name. He nodded slowly. I understand that. And I do love you for you. Nothing changes that. I studied his face, searching for any doubt or hesitation, but I found none. He meant every word. My heart swelled with gratitude. But I have to ask, he continued, his voice careful. What happens now? Your father, does he know that you are married? That you are a Lancaster now? I hesitated. I do not know, I admitted. We have been distant for years. But I think it is time I reach out to him. Daniel squeezed my hand. Then I will be right beside you when you do. A warmth spread through me. Despite everything, Daniel had never wavered. He had chosen me, not because of my last name, but because of who I was. The morning sun streamed through the large windows as I sat in my study, staring at my phone. It had taken days of contemplation, but I finally gathered the courage to make the call. I dialed the number, my fingers trembling slightly. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. This is Alexander Grayson. For a moment, I could not speak. I had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but now that I was actually hearing his voice, I felt like a child again. Father, I finally said. A pause. Then a sharp intake of breath. Elena? Yes, I whispered. Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice softened. I never thought I would hear from you again. I was not sure if I wanted to reach out, I admitted. But things have changed. He exhaled. Tell me everything. I did. I told him about Daniel, about Evelyn, about how I had kept my identity hidden. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. Then my father chuckled. You are truly your mother's daughter, he said. Tears stung my eyes at the mention of my mother. I miss her. So do I, he said. And I have missed you. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Do you think we can fix this? There was a pause. Then with quiet conviction he said, yes. Come see me. Bring your husband. It is time we set things right. I smiled. I would like that. Evelyn Lancaster had not spoken to me since that night. At first, she had tried to ignore the truth, pretending as though nothing had happened. But society had changed the way they looked at me. Now, I was not just some girl who had married into their world. I was Elena Grayson, daughter of Alexander Grayson, a name that held weight far beyond their own circles. And no matter how much Evelyn disliked it, she could not erase that truth. Daniel and I visited my father's estate the following month. He welcomed us with open arms, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. You are stronger than I ever imagined, he told me one evening as we sat in his grand study. Your mother would be proud. Tears welled in my eyes. I hope so. He looked at Daniel, studying him carefully. And you, he said. You stood by my daughter when others tried to tear her down. Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. I love her. Nothing else matters. My father nodded in approval. Good. Then I trust her happiness with you. It was a moment of acceptance I had never expected, but had always longed for. Evelyn finally reached out after weeks of silence, inviting us to dinner. I knew it was not an act of kindness, but rather a realization that she could not afford to alienate me any longer. When Daniel and I arrived, she was already seated at the dining table, poised and composed as always. But there was something different in her eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had miscalculated. Elena, she said, her tone careful. Evelyn, I replied smoothly. A long silence stretched between us before she finally spoke again. I may have underestimated you. I arched an eyebrow. Yes, you did. Her lips pressed together, but to my surprise she nodded. Perhaps I was too quick to judge. I only wanted the best for my son. I held her gaze. And now you know that I am the best for him. Evelyn sighed. It seems so. It was not quite an apology, but it was as close as she would ever come. And for me that was enough. As we sat down to dinner, I realized something. I had won. Not just against Evelyn, but against every doubt, every whisper, every person who had ever tried to make me feel unworthy. I had proven that true worth was not determined by wealth or status, but by resilience, integrity, and love. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.